Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Leanne, and I'm the education coordinator here at the People's Forum. If you haven't been here before, the People's Forum is a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities. We provide educational and cultural programming, and as part of our mission, it's our responsibility to provide opportunities to discuss and engage with the situation that's currently unfolding in Venezuela, not just because to counter the constant misinformation that we're being fed through the media, but also to counter the desensitization of warfare, whether it's economic, political, or via militarized actions from the US to countries abroad. So we're really grateful that you came out on a Thursday evening to engage with us. And thank you all for coming. And with that, I'll pass it off to our panelists.
Thank you, Layan. How's everyone doing tonight? Good, good. We wanted to make several things clear before we started our panel. One is that we identify as a space, as a forum, as a movement hub for working class people. And it is grounded in this understanding of who we are as working class people that we display very firmly and very loudly our solidarity with Venezuela. We understand that who's under attack right now is the working class globally. It just happens to be that the full brunt of that force right now is on the working class of Venezuela because they chose to lead an independent project against the interests of the United States government and all their corporations and all their friends on Wall Street, who happen to be equally our enemies here in the US. So we are not here to, mince words about whether we like Maduro or not, or whether we are kind of in favor of the Venezuelans or maybe not completely supportive. We are completely 150% support of the Venezuelan people and the process that they have democratically unleashed for the last 20 years. In line with that, we are honored tonight that we have enlisted the support and the presence of 3 radical intellectuals of the working class, thinkers that are grounded in our struggles, and who have come to reflect with us on what is the current status of our relations with Venezuela. How do we characterize this attack of imperialism on the people of Venezuela, and how have they been resisting? Because these are precisely the things that we are not hearing enough about, not just in mainstream media, but also, sadly enough, in the media of the left. Very often the left is still trying to keep its personal integrity before defending working class people in struggle across the planet. So we would like to invite the panelists to join us and sit at the table. We have amazing organizer intellectuals, organic intellectuals. We have Elizabeth Birriel, who is an organizer with the Answer Coalition, which is the major group that is calling, along with many others in the country, for a national mobilization on March 16th. And she's also an organizer with the Justice Center in El Barrio, which has been one of these really amazing grassroots community spaces that is half gym, half community organizing space, half hangout spot for so many young radical organizers in Uptown Manhattan. We also have Claudia de la Cruz, who, apart from being Director of Culture here at the People's Forum, has been a long-time thinker and organizer in the struggle, working with young women of color across New York City, but also across the country. Her work as a theologian, as a public thinker, as an educator, a popular educator, has led to, over the last 20 years, to a lot of these connections between working class struggles in the United States and abroad, specifically in Latin America. And we also have George Cicarello Mayer, who it's really our honor to welcome him for the first time here to the People's Forum. He is an organizer, a writer, and a radical political theorist. He has been a visiting scholar at UNAM and also at the Venezuelan School of Planification or Planning. Among the highlights I've always say of George is that he has been one of the clearest voices, writing in many important mediums like The Nation and others, speaking clearly on the struggle of the working class in Venezuela. If you have not read any of his books, I strongly recommend you check out a couple of them, including We Created Chavez, and also Building the Commune, Radical Democracy in Venezuela, because they are both key influential texts to understanding the process of the Venezuelan Revolution and why is it that 20 years later they're still resisting. Thank you to each of the panelists for sharing this evening with us, and we invite the debate that comes out of this space. Claudia will be starting off, then George, and we'll be ending with Elizabeth.
Gracias, Manolo. How's everybody doing?
Good.
You look good.
Chilling.
I'm glad y'all are good. So, like Manolo said, my name is Claudia de la Cruz. And I was born in the South Bronx. And it's a dope community in the Bronx. If you haven't been there, visit sometime. But the South Bronx happens also to be the poorest congressional district in the United States. Currently, there are 49% of the people living in the South Bronx that are living in poverty. We are part of a large community of 140 million people who live in poverty in the United States of America. 140 million. We, as a nation, have close to 8 million people living in homelessness. Right? Because we think about homelessness only as the folks that are living in the streets. But there are different levels of homelessness and people who experience levels of homelessness in other forms. We have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world as a nation. So when I hear number 45 talk about humanitarian aid and a humanitarian crisis, you know that I'm scratching my head, right? I'm trying to figure out whether him and his, buddies don't see the economic, the moral crisis that this country is experiencing, particularly and more like seriously because of capitalism, right? But there's a particular interest that goes beyond Maduro as a president when it comes to Venezuela. The attacks on Venezuela did not start yesterday or did not start last month, did not start, a year ago, and it did not start with Trump. In fact, when the first talks about sanctions came out under Obama, and we need to remember that. We need to remember that Venezuela is a very important piece to what the capitalist, game is. And I say game loosely because of the impact that capitalism has had worldwide. And so when we talk about Venezuela today, we're talking about the battleground for anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist struggles in the world. And that's the importance of Venezuela right now, where if we do not, as people of consciousness, come together and understand how important Venezuela is to the changing forces within capitalism and why it is important for Trump particularly to come out with these type of threats and aggression that have escalated at this particular point. As we move into an electoral year, then we're missing the point. Why did I start saying that I'm from the South Bronx? In 2005, Chavez came to this poor community that hadn't been yet visited by any other president than Fidel, probably. And he came in 2005 and he identified a very, very basic need in that community. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to understand that if you live in this side of the country where there's cold, it's cold outside right now, right? Super cold. Like, my body wasn't meant to live in this condition. I'm just got to put that out there. But you have thousands of people who were living without access to heating because they couldn't pay for it. And Chavez came in 2005 and said, this is a basic human right. People should have heating. And there was a project that began in 2005 that was called Petro Bronx that provided thousands of families in the South Bronx with heating for free through Citgo. Okay? Now, a couple of years later, there was the development of social programs that reached the most historically marginalized communities: youth, elders, immigrants. And those were the social programs that were also developed with the Bolivarian Revolution support, the support of the Venezuelan people, okay? Because I want to make that clear. It was the Venezuelan people and its Bolivarian Revolution that supported and gave to the poorest congressional district in the United States. And here we are talking about this same loving, resilient community as a threat in 2019, and threatening with a military intervention and enforcing sanctions. Now, when we talk about sanctions, it's a very empty concept. Like, people talk about sanctions and it's like, oh, you know, sanctions on Iran, sanctions here, sanctions. But if we don't describe what sanctions are to our people, then it's hard for them to know the impact that sanctions have on human life. I visited Venezuela in the last 2 months. First, for the installation of President Maduro in January 10th, and later with a People's Assembly that was held in Venezuela. I was there for 10 days with other delegates from around the world. And I didn't see a humanitarian crisis. What I saw were the wounds of people who have had a war waged against them economically. That's what I saw. People who continue to resist and are resilient and are saying Chavismo is alive and well, and we will die if we have to, but we will not go back to being slaves. That's what I saw, right? I saw people that were hungry to connect struggles that are being blocked by a media campaign that is not only about smearing and about delegitimizar. That's my immigrant. Delegitimize. There you go. Delegitimize the government, right? We're talking about a campaign that is blocking access, not only for us about the reality of Venezuelan people, but is also blocking access for them to know that there are communities in struggle within the United States that connect with them more than our government. People wanted to know about the reality of the homeless people. They wanted to know about the reality of the folks in the military, the veterans, because they were concerned about a military invasion that could potentially kill young, poor, black people from the United States of America. And so I saw love, I saw resistance, I saw resilience, and I saw a commitment to maintain a project that has become a threat to the United States because of the United States' hypocrisy to the world. Because we want to say we are democratic. Now, I'm going to ask a question, and it might seem kind of like funny to y'all, but it's not funny to me. How many of you can say that you've voted 25 elections in 20 years? That's what's happened in Venezuela. There have been 25 elections in the last 20 years in Venezuela. And not only that, you have processes of not only representation, but participation. That's what makes it democratic, that people are actively participating in making politics in Venezuela. Las comunas. That's what I saw. I saw old grannies taking in food that was received by the community from the government and making pots of food for the community. We live in the richest country in the world, and we have 6 million of people that go to sleep hungry every night, and that's an undercount in this country. When we talk about humanitarian crisis, we don't want to talk about the millions of undocumented people that are invisibilized and have to make themselves invisible too to avoid persecution in this country. People who have ran from all sorts of conditions that have been created by this country. And so being in Venezuela and sharing those realities opened the eyes of how connected we are, and also how committed a lot of us are to be able to maintain the Venezuelan revolution, because we understand that a military invasion in Venezuela means the intervention in Cuba, the intervention in Nicaragua, the intervention in any space of this world where people say, we want a better life. It doesn't even have to carry socialism with it. When people say we don't want capitalism, whatever alternative it is, means a military intervention, it means the strangling of the economy. And that's why Venezuela right now is the epicenter of our struggles. Whether we believe or not in socialism, I'm a socialist. That doesn't mean everybody gotta be. Now, what we have to be in agreement about is capitalism is a system of death. And it's something that we should not want to maintain ourselves in. And so anyone that thinks like that is a threat to the United States government, is a threat to its buddies. We want to talk about a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, but we're not talking about the fact that there's 30 million worth of assets that are being kidnapped from the Venezuelan people. That's what a sanction is. Okay? And if we think about just historically how empires have worked, it's precisely that. It happened in Chile with the strangling of the economy. It happened in the Dominican Republic. It's happened everywhere. And then there's a justification of a military invasion. And so we need to do our best, our very best. Whether, like Manolo said, this is not a debate of whether we like Maduro or not. This is not a debate of whether we support socialism or not. We're very clear in this space what we support and what we're for. And we're not trying to convince you all to be on that same plane, but we are trying to convince y'all to be people of consciousness and to be able to replicate the consciousness in this country, which is lacking. Now, another piece to this and I will end with this because I'm talking too much. Another piece to this is, I saw like the high level of commitment of the Venezuelans to be able to deepen their political education through culture, through schools. Like the numerous amount of schools for political education they're just mind-blowing. The different cultural projects and collectives are also mind-blowing. And again, these are models that capitalism does not want us to learn from, does not want us to see, because it is what is possible. It's a radical imagination of the future and the present. And that's what we're struggling for. The radical imagination of the future, building it right now. And it doesn't mean that it's perfect, because we can't be blind to many mistakes, but it means that it's different and it's a process. And if we're willing and if we're wanting to be able to guarantee the survival of our species, that's what Venezuela means today, the survival of a species. And so I'll leave that there. Thank you all for bearing with me. And George?
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the organizers. This is my first time in this beautiful space, and I'm glad to be here. I'm sure there will be many more opportunities. I I don't want to alarm you, but most of what you hear about Venezuela is false. Many of the lies that we're fed on a daily basis have, at best, partial truths buried within them that you have to know how to excavate. And I feel like a lot of people in this room probably have access to the critical tools necessary to dig into those things, but even then, it's just a constant barrage of lies in the media from top to bottom, from the long-term history of this Bolivarian process to the detailed events of the last couple of weeks. And so I want to try to cut through some of that, or as much of that as I can in the next few minutes without talking too long. But it goes back to something that you mentioned, namely the fact that this process in Venezuela was never about individuals. It was never about, it's not about Maduro today. It was never about Chavez as an individual. If we want to identify a starting point for the Bolivarian Revolution, it was 30 years ago last week, 1989, February 27th. No one knew who Chavez was. He wasn't involved, he was not a public figure, but what happened was the US-backed government in Venezuela, the so-called democratic government, attempted to drive through a structural adjustment reform package that meant that people who were already suffering, who were already starving, were going to suffer more, were going to starve more. And it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and people took to the streets, resisted, rioted for a week, and they were met with massacre, thousands of people killed. This is what we're talking about. First of all, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the repression of Venezuelan capitalism. But also, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the history. This wasn't about electing an individual. It wasn't about progressive candidates, although they can be cool sometimes. But it was about people resisting in the streets and making sure that the change that they were demanding was set into motion. And that's what they did. Even once Chavez was elected, which took place, if people recall, after a coup that he attempted, he tried to overthrow the existing government. We're not against all coups. We're against the bad ones. And he did so because he and others wanted to support the demands of those that had taken to the streets. And it was those very movements and those very people that had been organizing for decades that then pressured Chavez to run for president. He didn't want to. He didn't want anything to do with it. And he was elected. And in power, for the most part, he was, and certainly more than any other political leader of the past century, he has reflected and represented the authentic demands not only of the people abstractly understood, but of revolutionary movements in Venezuela. This meant, first of all, taking care of the people, providing social welfare, free education, free healthcare, and we're talking education from literacy up through university-level education. Free healthcare, not just in public hospitals that you have to travel to, but in your neighborhood, in Cuban-run modules of, staffed by Cuban-run doctors. But this was about also more than just social welfare. It was about providing what's called protagonism, access to political participation in Venezuela. And so you see the development of what were called communal councils, directly democratic spaces where people locally could get together and make real decisions about what happens in their communities. And more recently, we saw the development, of course, of what are called communes, which are, I don't want to say unprecedented, but they're like nothing that exists in our world today. You and your neighbors get together, sit down directly, democratically, discuss what's going to be produced, how to produce it, how to sell it, what to do with the surplus, how to distribute that surplus into the development of the community. In other words, actually existing revolutionary democratic socialism that exists in Venezuela in many spaces. Now, it doesn't exist everywhere. And these experiments, these grassroots revolutionary experiments, are beset by a number of challenges in the present. Fundamental among these is the crisis. But we need to understand what it is that this crisis means, where it comes from. The crisis is real, it is severe. It has been going on for, I would say, at least 6 years now. And there's blame that can go all around, right? The government, I think, failed to act when it should have acted in terms of straightening out some problems in the currency control system. But what's happening simultaneously is that Chavez had died. Immediately, the opposition refused to recognize Maduro's election, which was, of course, fair and clean. Immediately, they started sabotaging the economy, and immediately, early stage of sanctions kicked in, all at the same time that the oil price is collapsing. So we've got the beginnings of a crisis that then begins to swirl out of control. What then enters into play is a stage of systematic sabotage by not necessarily even just sort of like opposition leaders planning to try to overthrow the government, but just capitalists, just people trying to make money, just the people, the private sector in Venezuela, smuggling goods across the border, speculating on the value of the currency, refusing to provide goods at subsidized prices. And so you've got a government that's attempting to allow people access to the goods that they need, and you have capitalists hoarding these, keeping them in warehouses, refusing to sell them. You have absolute and direct sabotage of the economy. What's strange about the crisis is that, first of all, the people that suffer the most are the poor. I think we all know this. And this already came up in interesting ways, which is the fact that people, the opposition today likes to talk about the election being unfair, Maduro's election last year. They like to talk about the economic crisis, but they've been trying to take down this process for 20 years, when the economy was good and when it was bad, when the elections were clean and when there were questions about them. It was never a question of the legitimacy of the process. They wanted to destroy it at all costs. And what I say is peculiar and even perverse about it is that makes them, I think, excited that the economy is bad. Wealthy Venezuelans and the opposition, and certainly Marco Rubio and Trump and others, are glad to see people suffering because this is fodder for their machine, right? So you have this opposition leader, Juan Guaido, naming himself president. This is a coup. There is no constitutional basis for this maneuver. I mean, y'all can read the Constitution. You don't have to be an expert to read Article 233 of the Constitution, which says that for the head of the National Assembly to become interim president, the president has to have absolutely abandoned their position. This never happened. Never happened. It's a coup. It has been a coup. Even if you believe that story, the period during which elections needed to be held, according to the Constitution, was 30 days. That has already passed. He has absolutely no standing, even in their own argument. What Juan Guaido expected, what he promised to Trump and Pence, as it turns out, was that when he named himself president on January 23rd, the military would immediately collapse in fragments. That at least half of the Venezuelan military, generals and all, would join the opposition. That did not happen. So then 1 month later, February 23rd, they engaged in a charade at the border with so-called humanitarian aid. Now, I say so-called because even organizations like the Red Cross called this, quote, not humanitarian aid. By that they meant that it was a clear political maneuver. The UN denounced it as politicized and didn't want anything to do with it. That didn't stop opposition forces on the border from wearing the insignia of the Red Cross, which the Red Cross then had to denounce. And this should remind people of the Contra War in Nicaragua, when Contra troops and weapons were being flown in from the US in planes that were painted to look like Red Cross planes. Not surprisingly, Elliot Abrams, the same person, is in charge. So they set up this fake humanitarian aid. Again, this is aid that could be used in the Bronx, but also could have been used in the Colombian Guajira. You see, it must have been strange for indigenous people in eastern Colombia to see these trucks drive by and for them to think to themselves, but we could use some of that aid over here. It's not to mention the human rights abuses of the Colombian government. But the whole point was to provoke a crisis. It was to provoke chaos. People may have seen trucks on fire. Those trucks were lit on fire by opposition, probably accidentally, because the opposition was sitting there throwing Molotov cocktails toward the border. It was a charade. And you really don't need to look very far to understand that it was a charade. Millions of dollars of aid were on those trucks. The low millions. We're talking about single-figure millions. The US sanctions have already cost Venezuela well over $10 billion. $7 billion with a B dollars worth of assets were seized from Citgo and handed over to Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido is demanding access to more than $1 billion in gold held by the Bank of England. This is money that, if anyone cared about humanitarian crisis, could be used to support the well-being of poor Venezuelans, but that's not what they want, of course. And thank you so much for bringing out the human cost of this. Mark Weisbrot, a good economist in DC, has said that clearly in the thousands or tens of thousands have been killed by the sanctions already. And that was a relatively tame sanction regime compared to what Trump just instituted, which amounts to an oil blockade and which is making it almost impossible for the Venezuelan government to even buy medicine, even if they wanted to. They can't buy it from the US. They have to buy it from a different country. That financial transaction has to go through some other country with a less developed banking system because it can't go through New York or London. This is how this financial blockade, this oil blockade is working. And it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of lives if it's kept intact, because we're talking about $7 billion a year that will be lost from the Venezuelan economy. So there's this charade of humanitarian aid. Not to mention the fact that picture if the migrant caravan showed up in Tijuana with Molotovs, with weapons, and tried to break down the border. Now, leaving aside the fact that I'd probably be down with that, think of what Trump would say, right? Think about what this narrative of the border would look like then. Because he was precisely demanding that the border be porous in Western Venezuela when he wanted this fake aid to enter, as he's attempting to shore up the southern border. So this is all a charade, the humanitarian aid, everything. What's the next step? Immediately after the failure of this so-called aid delivery, you had Guaido looking incredibly desperate, saying that now all measures were on the table, and he went straight to the Lima Group, which is a group of right-wing Latin American countries. It was all right-wing until López Obrador was inaugurated in Mexico, and so now suddenly the Lima Group had this president who wasn't going to play along and refused to recognize this usurper, and has created a whole headache for them. But Guaido ran to the Lima Group and asked them to endorse military intervention into Venezuela. And they said, despite being more conservative countries in Latin America, they said no. Pence apparently was furious with Guaido that the military did not break and join him. And so it looks as if, for now, this coup is stalling. This coup is failing. But that absolutely doesn't mean that the danger is over, because they're not going to stop. They have no interest in stopping. And what they're going to do is tighten the screws through the sanctions, make people suffer, in Nixon's words, make the economy scream, and use that as leverage for supporting a coup further down the road. This is how this humanitarian narrative works, right? You make things worse until people do what you want them to do. In 1990, the Nicaraguan people voted the Sandinistas out of office in a clean and fair election on paper, right? But they voted knowing that if they voted for the Sandinistas, the Contra War would continue and the sanctions would continue. That means that is not a clean and fair election. And this is the kind of election that many people are asking for, demanding today in Venezuela. Now, without getting too deep into it, because like I said, I think you all can see through a lot of this stuff, but there is nevertheless a lot of misinformation or just bad, I would say bad political posturing that happens on the left as well when it comes to Venezuela. Because people want to just show how, they want to show that they have a distance from Maduro. Of course, the first mistake, as we've said multiple times already, is to assume that this is about Maduro to begin with. This is not the question. It's about the revolutionary grassroots of the Bolivarian process that are continuing to fight. It's about the communes that know that if they lose power, there will be a military attack on them because they represent an alternative. Their territories will be taken from them if the government loses power. So it's not about Maduro, it's about these grassroots. And it's about the fact that these revolutionary movements on the grassroots level are the ones that are suffering from government mismanagement. They are the ones that suffer from military corruption. All of these things that you hear Trump and Guaido and Marco Rubio talking about it is the Venezuelan poor that suffer this. But at the same time, many, thousands, hundreds of thousands, understand that the only way forward is through a deepening of this revolutionary process. And it's not just a political question, it's an economic question as well. Because the crisis today, just as the crisis 30 years ago that started the Bolivarian Revolution, is caused by global capitalism and the way that an oil economy functions under global capitalism. It's caused by this oil dependency that means that Venezuela imports almost everything that it consumes and has to rely on oil exports to do so. And the only alternative to that, the opposition does not have an alternative to that aside from embracing global capitalism. neoliberal structural adjustment, privatizing the oil industry, and hoping that global corporations will somehow save the Venezuelan people, but they don't really care about that. The only solution comes through the revolutionary grassroots organization, reorganization of the economy, restructuring of the economy. And this is what the communes represent, where people are producing locally what they need, deciding democratically what they need. And these have been the people that have protected and defended the Bolivarian Revolution always. These are the people that brought Chavez to power. These are the people that brought Chavez back to power during a coup in 2002. These are the people that are holding out and refusing to bow to this coup today, despite the fact that their lives are getting worse, despite the fact that not doing what the US says means more suffering in the long run. And it's through these grassroots that the only path forward and the only path out of this crisis needs to be charted. Thank you.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit more about like our role here and how all this stuff relates. We in the Answer Coalition called a national day of action in front of the White House. There'll be another demonstration out on the West Coast for March 16th. And when we put out the call for this national demonstration, it was right at the verge where it was a very strong, imminent threat of military invasion of Venezuela. And we saw US planes, military planes, heading their way using my beautiful island of Puerto Rico as a way to like get the Marines up and going. We saw the Brazilian and Colombian armies getting ready to engage in some kind of way. And then we saw this self-declared president ask for military intervention, calling for their own military in Venezuela for mutiny. We saw how quickly the handlers in Washington began to seize assets and give billions of dollars of seized Venezuelan assets to Guaido. And real quick, ultimatums were being thrown at the Venezuelan people. They were asking Maduro to step down. The media went on a frenzy to demonize the Venezuelan government and the democratic process that's happening in Venezuela. And we need to think about why, right? Like, why would they like go through so much effort to demonize Venezuela? And it's a psychological thing, right? Like, if you think that Venezuela is so messed up, when they want to go to war with Venezuela, it makes a more better justification, right? Because you can't sell war so easily without demonizing who you're trying to go to war with. And that's just you know, preparing you for this escalation of attack. And so as anti-war activists and anti-imperialist activists, people jumped into the streets real quick. On February 23rd, there were hundreds of actions throughout the United States saying no military invasions in Venezuela. I like to call it hands off Venezuela. You call it whatever you want, but it was important to like have that momentum going and show that the people of the United States are not for this military intervention. And like the two comrades over here were saying, despite all this media frenzy, despite all the attempts of our elite class here in the United States, despite these right-wingers out in Venezuela trying to crush the Bolivarian Revolution, the Venezuelan people haven't broken, and I'm pretty sure they won't. And we have to understand that the Bolivarian movement is not representing just Maduro. It represents millions of Venezuelans who have put all their time and effort to building this revolutionary process, and also to defend their sovereignty. And so, like it was mentioned, the stunt of this like humanitarian aid that took place at the border, it failed. Like it completely failed. And you know what, like as a Puerto Rican woman, like I think it's disgusting that Trump had the audacity to say, you won't let our military BS humanitarian aid come into Venezuela. But Venezuela was so quick, and Cuba was so quick to say, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. We got you. You need doctors, you need supplies. We can bring that in right now. And what did Trump say? He said, absolutely not. You cannot bring any humanitarian aid to the people of Puerto Rico. And because of that, thousands of Puerto Ricans died. But we don't talk about that in the news. And I had to make that quick Puerto Rican plug because that really, really irks me every time I hear about this humanitarian aid, because it's just complete nonsense. And so, with all this going and knowing that this coup seems like it's clearly not working, right? But what does that mean for us, right? Like, does that mean that we just stop, that we just chill, and we don't continue the struggle? Absolutely not, right? Because the threat is still very present. There's still this urge for regime change. It's been a playbook that they've been trying to push for over a decade, and the imperialists continue to tighten their economic sanctions. They keep regrouping on what's the next phase of aggression, and we know that that next phase of aggression is try to eliminate any kind of left-wing type government that's happening, whether it's in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. They're just trying to eliminate the left in Latin America. They're seizing the Venezuelan gold, their oil, their cash. They're just straight up thieves, just taking all of their resources that the people have put all their sweat and blood and all their work to generate this wealth, to give back to the communities, to build homes, to make sure people have access to food. And I don't know what else to call this but straight up colonialism, because that is what it is. It's beyond this neo-colonialism stuff. It is straight up colonialism. And the sanctions and the asset seizures, they don't make the headlines. I don't see New York Times, Washington Post, or CNN talking about what these sanctions mean, right? They don't do that. But I want to provide a more conceptualized thing of what sanctions really mean. And I want to use the example of Iraq, because I think it's really important for us to not forget what happened, because sanctions kill the same way that bombs do. And they cause the same amount of suffering that war does. And in Iraq, just like Venezuela, they were trying to build their economy, but it's still very dependent on oil exports to purchase foods and get other industrial goods for the country. And we saw that the US and NATO and their NATO allies imposed a complete blockade on Iraq before the war in Iraq even began. And from the sanctions alone, 2 million Iraqis died out of a population of 26 million people from the sanctions and blockade alone, not from bombs, not from bullets, but from economic sanctions. And about half of those that died were children under the age of 5. I don't think anyone in this room thinks that children under the age of 5 should die because some imperialist wants to steal the oil and resources of another nation. So that's why we've been out in the streets all around the country. That's why we need to be out in the streets in Washington. That's why people have been having teach-ins. That's why we're having this discussion right now, because we also need to build our narrative, the people's narrative, and tell our stories and tell what's really going on, because no one's going to do that for us. CNN isn't going to do that for us. The New York Times isn't going to do that for us. So we need to provide our own context for what is happening, and we need to be very clear that sanctions is not an alternative, it's not an option on the table either, that it is a part and a form of war in itself. And we know that the Venezuelan people, our struggle isn't that far from theirs. We want the same thing. We want social equality. We want to have the right to have a home. We want the right to have jobs. That's what the Venezuelan people want, and that's what they're fighting for, and that's what they're building in their country. But it's really hard to do all of that when you're in a world dominated by global capitalism, when someone else wants to take what you have so that they can line their pockets. And so, you know, we don't see our struggle to be that different from the people of Venezuela, but we have a very different and very critical role to play here in the United States. Our role is to stand up against the biggest bully in the world and make sure that the chief enemy of the Venezuelan people, the US government, is kept in check. Like, we need to stand up to our government and say, you cannot do this in the name of us, because we do not support this effort of war. We do not support these sanctions, and we have a moral and special responsibility to say no, that this is not going to happen in our name. And so whether John Bolton, Donald Trump's national security advisor on CNN might say that in this administration, we are not afraid to use any phase of the Monroe Doctrine, just think about what that even means. It's an open declaration of imperialism, an open declaration that the US has the right to determine which government lives and which one dies in the Western Hemisphere. But we're going to make sure that our voices are heard and that that's not what the people in the United States want. The same way that the people in the United States said we don't want to be in Vietnam, we don't want our resources to be going to war. People in the Bronx need heat. Why does Venezuela have to give people in the Bronx heat? Why isn't our government giving people heat? Why isn't our government making sure that our people are fed and have access to health care? Like, we need to raise those questions the same way the people did in the 1970s, and when that anti-war movement was strong and at its strongest, and we need to maintain that same spirit. We're gonna be out in front of the White House, and Trump's gonna hear us loud and clear about that. We have a bus leaving from here. We have a bus leaving from Union Square. We have a bus leaving from the Bronx, because Pedro Bronx is about that life, and they want a bus, and they want to be out there. And we also have Haiti Liberté having another bus leave out of Brooklyn. So if you are not going on a bus, please try to go on a bus. Like, if you know someone that might want to be down to go out on a bus, like, make sure we spread the word that we have, if not thousands and tens of thousands of people out in the street, that it's super critical, because we can't have our young Black and brown youth going to fight the Venezuelan people, because the Venezuelan people don't want to fight our Black and brown youth. Right. Like, they just want to keep the US out of their country, but they're going to have to do what they ought to do. But we shouldn't fight a rich man's war, and we shouldn't have to bear that burden. And so I just want to say, hands off Venezuela, and I hope you guys can come. If you want any more information, we can talk about that after.
Thank you to the panelists. I think each and every one of you have said really powerful statements. I think it's clear to us that what's happening right now in the streets of Caracas, in the streets of every town and city in Venezuela, is actually the battle for humanity. Our lives are at stake right now in Venezuela. And we want this to be a space for debate and dialogue. We actually want to invite your questions and comments. So if you want to share something, raise your hand and we'll pass you the mic.
Hi. Oh, this is really, okay, this is nice. Yeah. I'm Natalia. I'm also with the Answer Coalition, and if you're from New Jersey by chance, there's also buses leaving from Jersey, so hit me up. But also I just wanted to ask the panelists that feel comfortable speaking on this topic that the opposition, one of their tactics is that they use their youth, from these countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela and sometimes Cuba. They use them to foment their movements on their campuses. So what is the role of that, and why is it so effective? Yeah, so that's my question.
Can I take at least 2 more hands before we pass on to the panelists?
Hi. So in the United States, a lot of people talk about concepts of racial capital. And I understand in Latin America, there's a completely different social, economic, and historical kind of trajectory of race. But when I see images of the protests in 2015, 2016, in the United States, it would be largely black versus white. The white standing for the opposition and black people of color standing against them. And I was wondering if questions of race, could that help us with this kind of analysis? Without kind of like instantiating U.S. concepts into what's happening in Venezuela.
Hey, I just my question is, how can we link the Venezuelan people's struggle with the struggle of the people in IT that is currently happening right now?
That's a lot. I'm gonna start with these two over here because I think they also, are really important in the way they speak to each other. I mean, Venezuela and Haiti, if you go way back, you're talking about before Venezuelan independence and everything. You've got rebellions across the hemisphere, and you've got in particular the Haitian Revolution, sparking slave uprisings in Venezuela. Sparking resistance, across, and this is in lots of different countries. You've got Bolivar, receiving shelter in Haiti, being radicalized. It still didn't radicalize him enough, but it inspired, in many ways, his own struggles to liberate the Gran Colombia. And you've got this continuing today, because you've got the continued symbolic importance of Haiti as a successful slave revolution. You hear people talking about that in Venezuela. Rich people. People who are scared of that, right? People who understand their own underclass, black and brown poor, to be potentially that rebellious that they might rise up and kill their masters. And this resonance continues today. And it speaks a lot to the echoes that Chavez saw, echoing, across the Caribbean. And they were incredibly important. And this gets right down into the details of the resistance that's going on in Haiti today, where people are in part frustrated by the fact that, on the one hand, the Venezuelan government helped them, right, through Petrocaribe. On the other hand, their own government sold out Venezuela, allowed itself to be blackmailed by the US in order to undermine Maduro. And so this is part of the resistance that's happening there. And I think that the influence goes back and forth. When it comes to the question of race, I think, very often in Venezuela, people would be like, oh, you're American, you're just kind of imposing that. And then they would be like, yeah, by the way, there's no racism here, right? And so, on the one hand, you do actually want to impose, a certain amount of, clear, understanding of what's going on, because there's still a racial binary. It just happens that there's a lot of different categories and they function in different ways, but the poorest people are still those perceived to be the darkest. And the people on TV, the richest people, the leaders of the opposition, I say formally on TV, because that changed, right? And this is crucially important, right? That on TV suddenly you would see black and indigenous people. It even took Chavez himself and leadership of Chavismo to be pushed by the grassroots sectors to recognize this and understand it, because they arrived saying, no, we're mestizos. There's no racism, we're all mestizos. And then they started to see the fact that the Venezuelan opposition called Chavez a monkey. They called him all sorts of things. They considered him to be black, even if he didn't at first consider himself to be that way, right? And so it was partly the movements, it was partly the opposition itself and its sort of rabid racism that advanced revolutionary consciousness along these lines, to the point where Afro-Indigenous consciousness was, incredibly amplified in the past 20 years. And that forms part of the struggles today. But it also informs part of the reason that the opposition would never accept Chavez, would never accept Chavismo, because those people don't look like they can govern, right? They don't look like they're fit to be in charge. They feel like the classic kind of displaced elite that think that they're the only ones that are allowed to be in power, really.
Thank you. And so the question around students, I want to be clear if I understood. I think you're asking here in the United States, students who are from Cuban descent, Nicaraguans, and utilizing or occupying them mentally to be able to act against their own people. Is that what you're saying? I mean, I think it's the same reason why, and I was speaking to someone today in terms of like, we need to understand the mental occupation of the masses as we understand the military occupation of a terrain. And I'll explain what that means. Like, once you occupy the mind, it's easy to weaponize it against their own people. Like, it doesn't just happen. Like, the way in which we're formed since the moment we're born, and that goes to gender, and that goes to many ways in which we discriminate against our own people, is a level of self-hatred and shame that is connected to that. If you tell people long enough, you know, the folks in Cuba that, you know, they're not your people, they're under a dictatorship, and this is how, you know, we have a whole bunch of Cubans now that are starting to understand what the history is between the United States and Cuba, just recently, right? A new generation that is more concerned or wanting to know more about Cuba, but that just started. But before then, you had a whole bunch of the oligarchy that literally left Cuba that continue to foment hatred against Cubans. And we see that around like the oligarchy of Venezuelans in Miami. Like, and we need to understand where that comes from, right? It's happened historically with, it's another way, again, another weapon to utilize against our own people. When you're able to have people that are coming from those spaces saying, wait a minute, that is true, that is what's happening. My people are dying because of this government, without actually gaining an understanding of what the roots are at that. That when we, and that's what I'm saying, like if we're able to describe more what sanctions are, like I would love to see a headline that says, the United States kills thousands of people in Venezuela because they can't get medical aid. Like, sanctions is too empty. What does it do to people? You know, and I think that that's what we need to start breaking down. What does it do to people? What has it done to the Cuban people when they've had an economic blockade just for the simple fact of deciding not to be capitalist and dare to build a revolutionary socialist project?
Any hands?
Hi, my name is Andre, and I have just three quick questions. My first one is, if the democratic principles of Venezuela are so intact as you were previously saying, then why was the National Assembly dissolved and only 32% of the population voted in the previous election? My second one is, if the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela is well and alive, then why are millions of people desperately escaping the country to Brazil and Colombia? And my third one is, if this is all not about Maduro, then why is he having dinner in the most expensive restaurant in the world in Turkey, while people are literally eating trash? Thank you.
I'm going to take these questions. Oh.
Very good questions. Thank you.
See? Okay. I'll take those questions in the best possible way that I can. The first is to say the National Assembly wasn't dissolved. I mean, it's there. So, I mean, we get our facts straight to begin with. The fact is that there are two legislative bodies, the election of a constituent assembly alongside it, because the National Assembly, immediately upon the opposition winning a free and fair election, which is a strange dictatorship that would allow for such a sweeping victory to have taken place, it happened, December 2015. The National Assembly, instead of legislating, and instead of leading, and instead of offering economic solutions for the crisis, instead immediately declared that its goal was to unseat the executive, in other words, to have a coup, and immediately contravened the ruling of the Supreme Court with regard to seating 3 deputies. When they did that, the Supreme Court declared them in contempt, and the legislature declared the Supreme Court in contempt, whatever that means. And this led to a constitutional crisis of powers. I mean, this is actually the details of what happened. So those things happened. And in the sort of long-standing deadlock that produced, which saw bloody violence in the streets, bloody blockades, in which this not-so-peaceful opposition unleashed violence on the people again, which they've done multiple times, 2004 and 3, 2014 and 2017. Maduro said, not because it was his first choice, but because he was trying to figure out ways out of this deadlock, let's elect a constituent assembly, which they did. The opposition boycotted, as they boycotted the election last year in 2018. And so you didn't ask this part, but we can be clear about this. There's really no question that Maduro won the election last year. Even the opposition, although they used the language that would suggest that the election was in question, there's no question about whether he won because they boycotted it. If they had supported the opposition candidate that did run, they might have won. You know, again, they can mobilize people, especially in a bad economy. But they refused to participate, which is why they lost. And so there are those questions. Wait, what was the first one?
And then there was a question with regards to Chavismo being alive and why are people migrating?
I mean, why are people migrating? People migrate for lots of different reasons. I mean, millions of Colombians migrated into Venezuela over the past 20 years. Many of them were granted citizenship. Many people are migrating back and forth. I'm not sure these numbers are very trustworthy, though, in part because a lot of people go back and forth every single day. You can go to the border right now, and I have friends who are there over the past couple of weeks on the border talking to people about why they're going over to Colombia in the morning, why they will definitely be coming back to Venezuela that night, right? I mean, this is part of the ideological sort of veil that we have to cut through when we want to discuss these things. The economy is bad. Part of what we've been talking about is the sanctions, billions and billions of dollars worth of sanctions, which isn't the only cause of the economic crisis, but it's a big part of it. And the economy is bad. People try to leave when the economy is bad. I don't know what's surprising about that.
I mean, I was going along the same routes in terms of like, there is economic migration and there's political migration, right? Like people migrate for different reasons. And throughout the world, people move when they need jobs. I mean, you could be in complete, like, in a complete agreement politically with where you are, but if economically you're struggling, you'll move. That's the story of immigrants throughout the world. My parents came from the Dominican Republic, and I can't say that they had political differences because at that particular moment, like, you know, my dad was very conservative, and he really loved, you know, Balaguer. So he didn't move based on political differences. He moved because economically he needed to migrate, right? And so it's the same case with people throughout the world. I can say that I've met people in Miami, just like I've met folks that are against and are part of the opposition for both Cuba and Venezuela, who are very supportive of the revolution, but they need to make ends meet. There are folks that I know in Venezuela that have left Venezuela, worked, and come back because economically they just can't sustain themselves and their family. And like was mentioned by George, you know, the sanctions have a very, very big part to do with that. There are other internal issues, and yet we just need to get in the consciousness that every nation should be free to decide what their destiny is. And no intervention should be made by any empire to be able to solve their problems.
Yeah, it's on? No, it is on. Okay. I just wanted to add that the economic warfare, in addition to the sanctions that's taking place in Venezuela by the oligarch in Venezuela, is also important to highlight. Because, for example, if something costs $1, right, one day, and then the right wing who owns 70% of the means of production, like let's get it straight, who owns the access to the goods and services that the Venezuelan people need? It's not the Venezuelan government. So something can cost $1, and then they just like, the cronies get together, and then the next day is like $20.
In the afternoon.
You were there, so you know better than I do. But, and so the government is trying to combat that by actually raising wages. But every time the government takes a measure to raise the wages so that people can buy the things that they need, the oligarch again goes and it's like, oh, it was $20, now it's $100. And so how is that possible for people to live in if they don't have so much? And the government is trying to do everything it can to make all of these necessities accessible. But some people are going to migrate because of the economic hardship, the same way people left Cuba during the special period. And I think we just need to acknowledge that no one here is saying that the Venezuelan economy is like booming and everyone has like an excess of anything. Is that they're facing serious challenges based off of sanctions and also internally with the ongoing economic war that's being placed on people. And it's just making it difficult.
So I have just, I'm going to moderate through the rest of the round. We'll get back to you after we've covered other people's questions. I have one person here, and I have a person there, and I have Jody there.
I was just going to say I wanted you to address his last question. I believe it was about why Maduro was eating in a fancy restaurant while people were eating from trash trucks.
I'll just say I'm a reporter. I got back from 4 weeks in Venezuela. I didn't see a single person eating from the garbage, despite potentially fake footage on CNN claiming otherwise. And we have seen no shortage of lies from CNN. There certainly are economic problems, but I didn't see anyone eating from the trash. In fact, my colleague and I went to numerous meetings in Venezuelan communes where they're giving out what they call the CLAP boxes, which is a food program provided by the government in which basically free food is given to families. And the government is expanding that program from once a month to twice a month and providing staples like rice, cornmeal, lentils, milk to families for basically free, to 6 million families. The other thing well, I'll let them speak about that, but I will say that when I got back to New York, I did see people eat from the garbage. In fact, the first day I got back.
Go back. Oh, Jody, now come back to you.
Thanks, Ben. That's what I was going to ask for. Some specific examples. You said you were there twice in the last 2 months, and if you could just take us a little deeper into maybe what the surprises were for you, or some stories of what you saw, what's missing, and how they're functioning within the economic crisis.
I'll take one more question, and we'll get back to the panelists.
So I've noticed that the conversation has somewhat diverted to Maduro as a kind of sign that we use to signify the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan polity. And I do think that this diversion is somewhat of an opportunity. As someone who kind of engages in decolonial studies, one thing that I always like to kind of remind myself is that the state in of itself is, of course, a colonial inheritance. And this is the way that the world system has itself been organized. And so when you take some sort of revolutionary movement and then you use the figurehead of the state and its excesses as a means of delegitimating the movement, this is colonial thought attempting to delegitimize an anti-colonial movement through recourse of its own kind of residue that it leaves all over the world. So we have said, I've heard some of you say that this is not really about Maduro. We should kind of move past Maduro and really talk about the people. But I think that there is a way to take Maduro as the figurehead of the state, the way that he's being discussed in discourse, and him as a kind of historical piece that's important, but of course not singular and not monolithic. Thank you. So yeah, maybe that wasn't a question, but I hope you're kind of taking it as a question. Thank you.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. I mean, I don't keep super close track on where Maduro's eating. I would be really surprised if any president goes to any country and is not treated to a nice meal. Like, I'm unemployed, but like my birthday's coming up. I'm trying to go to a nice restaurant. I'm not really, I'm not ashamed. Yay! I'm not ashamed about that. Like, good food is nice. Poor people should have good food. They shouldn't have bad food. But I think this point is super important, which is that, again, this focus on the individual. Listen, Maduro is not. The Maduro years, let's put it that way to start, have not been great, right? And some of that you can trace to decisions that maybe he and others have made. Some of that you can trace to the persistence of corruption, which absolutely exists, which has always existed, which goes up and down, but which has always been super bad in an oil economy in which all of this money is coming into the state and in which there's lots of opportunities for individuals to grab that. But you know what? Corruption in Venezuela is not just government officials, it's the private sector, because that money goes from the government to the private sector to import goods from the foreign market. A lot of times that money disappears. A lot of times that $1 million gets recirculated on the black market to be 100 million. And that's how this works. The corruption is public, it's private as well. But the reality is that we need to think about this in terms of what it means for the revolutionary movement. And what that's meant in the past few years has been, unfortunately, a weakening in the correlation of forces that existed before, in which the grassroots movements could very effectively leverage the government and could push Chavez and pressure him and encourage him to do this or that. There's more of a distance now, that's true. That's not necessarily the fault of the government. It has a lot to do with the fact that Maduro was dealt a shitty hand. He showed up in the middle of a crisis. He's tried to manage it. He's made some really good decisions that were surprising, and others have not panned out, and the economy is in free fall. We've seen that, and it's absolutely true. But the question is, what is it that revolutionary movements can do, want to do in this context? And it's to push forward, to deepen this revolutionary process, to support. I mean, some of the very same people. You've got leaders of the communes that have been targeted by the Supreme Court and targeted by high-ranking Chavista officials, who say, listen, that's fucked up what they've been trying to do to me, but this is the revolutionary process and we're pushing forward with it. And we support Maduro against foreign intervention, and we also support the revolutionary transformation of Venezuela in a more radical direction.
So just to answer the question in terms of what I saw, I mentioned it earlier, like in terms of how the comunas work, which is something that you shared as well. But one of the things that I think, and I've gone to Venezuela several times. I've been going to Venezuela since 2005, and I've seen the advances of a lot of things, social projects that have been evolving with the years. One of the things that always impacts me is the participation, like the political participation of youth. And, we understand politics very different here. We understand politics just massively as electoral politics. Young people in Venezuela understand that they're making politics every day, and that's part of what Chavismo taught them. And so these collectives, like the artist collectives or collectives of like self-organized and self-determined like industries, for example, of women that get together and are making shampoo and conditioner and like soap, and they're doing it as a collective. And so it's like una cooperativa, it's a cooperative. And these are models of self-sufficiency, because that's something that capitalism also takes away from us. Like, how many of us know how to build shit? Like, I was out there literally saying, man, if the time comes, I can't BS my way to make like a water pipe or none of that shit. Like, I don't know how to do that. But you have people that are learning what the basic tools are for their survival. And these are things that capitalism takes away from us by instant gratification and the purchasing of things that other people make, right? So I saw that. I saw people making what they needed to make in order to live, and doing that collectively. I saw the care that people have from the youngest to the elder, which is something that, I'm sorry to say, I was pregnant, and I would go into the buses or the the MTA and like the train, and I'd stand there at 8 months pregnant, and not one person would say, "Would you like to sit?" So there's a certain sensibility for those that are in need of care. This is the best example. We had a delegation of different folks from different countries, and some folks got sick in the delegation. And automatically, there was like, they're like the warriors in white. They just show up, the doctors. And how many of us, like, I know I've waited hours to be seen by a doctor. And the first question is, what type of insurance do you have? Then nobody asked me what type of insurance I had in Venezuela. And there were Venezuelans that were also being taken care of in the same space. And so, again, I saw the care for life over profit. The very basic things: food, healthcare, human contact. Like, I'm scared of like hugging people up in the States sometimes, because people be sensitive about that, But us Caribbeans, we like to hug. And I loved being in Venezuela, because God knows I got me some good hugs. It's the sensibility of like connecting, like humanity. How are you doing, and stopping and actually listening to how you're doing. We've lost that, right? And so there's a human connection, but there's also the care for the very basic human things that we need, that I saw in Venezuela, Jody, and that I think for me is that radical imagination for the future that needs to be continued in Venezuela and needs to be created here now,
I'm going to take the last round of questions or comments.
Hey, So my name is Idaline. Hi, y'all. So obviously you all know so much about the Venezuelan struggle and what's happening. For newbies who may not know how to process all the information that they're receiving in the media, what types of questions would you recommend that they would ask themselves when they're receiving the headlines and different conversations that they're hearing from their friends, such as people are eating from the trash cans? So what types of questions should people ask themselves as they're digesting the media? Thank you.
My dad is from Colombia. I'm from. Sorry. So, based on what my dad has told me, he's in Colombia. He sees the news over there, and he has helped people has moved from Venezuela to Colombia. He lives in from Bogota, so he has offered people roof and food sometimes to sleep. And people from Venezuela has told him that people out there has used the money to make art and sell it in the street. That's how devaluable the money has gotten in Venezuela because of the issue that this country and the dollar keeps going up. In Colombia, the dollar is now 3 times more valuable, which it's equivalent to you gotta work pretty much 3 times as hard to pretty much make the average of just to survive in a weekly basis in Colombia. And us letting that this country just keeps doing this, and we're gonna let this country just go inside Venezuela like this, it's just gonna let the issue spread around throughout whole South America. And just how my country is already being affected by this, other countries will also be. So we should also take action about this as soon as possible, and not just stay here and with the arms crossed about this. There's enough issues in this country that we should really take care about, and this is one of them also with the foreign policies. Thank you.
I just want to offer telesurtv.net as an alternative source of information. Obviously, you gotta remain critical from any media because they inherently have a political interest. But telesurtv.net is an alternative.
I'm going to take the last one.
What's up, y'all? My name is Ymir. Oh, this is really cool right here, using this mic. I was actually at the border with Cucuta in Colombia last year. And I remember I was taken there by a friend of my mom's that he was the private chauffeur of Carlos Andres Perez. He's like a Colombian Venezuelan. And you can just imagine when he tells me about Chavez and the revolution. He always tells me, oh, you know, el coño de madre de Chavez, he took away my house. I'm like, but he took away your house, but you were living here in the States when that happened. I don't know about that story. But he tried to take me to the border to kind of scare, kind of a Chavismo out of me. And I was going over there. And, you know, when you go to the border, like any other border, the Haitian-Dominican border or the Mexican, Texas border, I've been there too, you know. I was like, oh man, there's a lot of Venezuelans here, you know. You see kids selling arepas, you see people selling purses of the currency, bolivars, and I was like, man, maybe you might have a point. But I was like, wait a minute, why are all these people going back to Venezuela? I was there at night. I saw a whole group of people going to Venezuela, and you saw 5 people coming to the Colombian side, you know. So, I just wanted to share that story. But my question, and this was touched upon during this panel, is the devaluation of the currency over there, and just how the U.S. dollar plays into that. Because I've been following Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone, and he was saying, there's a lot of products in these supermarkets. But the problem is just the purchasing power and how you're able to purchase this more with U.S. dollars than what Bolivar is. So yeah, that's my question.
So if we could answer these last questions and then make any closing final comments.
Thank you all for those questions. I don't even know where to start. I'll start with this over here because Cúcuta is a wild place, right? But it's also like it's just wild to conceptualize as well. Because on the one hand, it's portrayed as a place where the inevitable effects of a faulty currency regime play out, right? That's what we're told it is. And yet at the same time, it's a place where that currency crisis is managed, is controlled, is transformed and deepened by speculators who live on the other side of the border, who run websites like the one that used to be called Dólar Today, that used to speculate on, set the black market price of the Bolivar to the dollar, drive it up artificially. And you can see this, it would get driven up around times of political crisis and others. It dropped when Guaidó, declared himself president, and you're just like, there's no economic dynamic that would explain that outside of pure speculative activity. Now, to make it as simple as possible, around 2012, 2013, there started to be a gap between the official rate of the Bolivar to the dollar and the black market rate. Those were more or less, they held together until around 2011, 2012. You started to have a gap. What did this mean? And it wasn't a big gap at first. The official rate was 2, but on the black market, you could get 4. So if you had a bunch of dollars, you could sell them. Things would be half as cheap. What happens when you're doing that, in other words, what happens when you have this gap is it creates an incentive to engage in currency speculation. And that currency speculation then becomes a part of a spiraling, a spiraling of the gap and of the black market rate. So, like I said before, the Venezuelan government gets billions of dollars in oil revenue, unfortunately hands those over to private companies to import food, to import goods that people need. Chavez used to say, we look like idiots, we look like pendejos giving all of these billions of dollars to private capitalists. We should know how to do this ourselves. Unfortunately, still many millions of dollars handed over to these capitalists. Like I said, some would just piece and they just disappear with $1 million, $2 million. Some would immediately invest that, or circulate that through the speculation market. And as a result of all this activity, nothing's being imported. And so you do have shortages sometimes. You probably heard about diapers, you heard about toilet paper once in a while. But most of the time it's precisely this, which is that there are goods on the shelves. It's just that the official exchange rate, you can't buy it, right? Something would cost $300 for a coffee or something like that. And so in response, of course, and people have mentioned this just briefly, the government introduced a program called CLAP, which provides directly subsidized free goods to households. And even opposition polls show that up to 60% of households receive these directly subsidized goods. This is to make sure that people are eating in the context of a currency crisis. Now, the neoliberal response to a currency crisis is to let those people starve. In other words, this is an imperfect response to a necessary social situation. What happened last week? Well, the opposition burned a warehouse where they were packaging and distributing these clap boxes. In other words, you're talking about a humanitarian crisis, and yet the opposition routinely attacks these, burns them, and this is outside of the hoarding and the other destruction of subsidized goods. And so again, this is not about humanitarianism. Again, absolutely, the Venezuelan government should have fixed the currency system back when it was easy to do. I was talking to the foreign minister recently, and he said, listen, at this point, it's almost impossible. We take economic action, nothing happens. Why? Because the economy is in crisis. The political system is in crisis. People are not, opposition members are engaged in direct sabotage every day. And it makes it very difficult for economic policy on a national level to work when things are this bad. And so at this point, there has to be some kind of ratcheting down of tension, political dialogue, and new economic policies put into place that will help stabilize the economy.
How to get this
Tap,
mic
tap,
straight.
tap.
Yeah, I got it. I wanted to talk a little bit about the question of how do we process what the mainstream media is telling us. I think we just need to be conscious about who owns the media. Because the same people who own Telemundo own some other big corporate channel, and so I'm going to be honest with you guys, my mom and I are not on speaking terms right now over the topic of Venezuela. And that's because the propaganda on Telemundo is so real. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, who owns the media? What is the message that the people who own the same subset of media is, because they don't own one channel and one newspaper, they own a whole chain of the media, and so the narrative is going to be the same. So what you see in the Washington Post and what you see on New York Times is going to be very similar. So I think it's very important for us to find alternative media, and get a different perspective, and then make our own decisions, right? Like not let a particular narrative dictate how you're going to consume the information. And I also think that it's important to understand, what has Venezuela accomplished, and looking at that too, because when a lot of the arguments that I like hear sometimes is like, well, there's so much corruption and they're stealing all the money, and I'm like, they just gave like 2 million people homes. They use the money that you say that they're stealing to give people homes, and not like the little BS apartments that we have in New York City where a family of 5 is living in a 1-bedroom apartment, like an apartment for 5 people to actually live in. And so I think we just need to do that. If y'all didn't see like the UN Security Council like footage of what went down, like y'all should watch that, because it was such a powerful like thing to see, like the foreign minister of Venezuela literally pull out receipts, like straight up pictures, like this is a little symbol of the Red Cross. The Red Cross said they didn't want anything to do with this humanitarian aid. This is, you can see here that the Colombian embassy is right here, and where the fire and the Mazutov stuff was coming from, and where the Venezuelan, actually the National Guard was, versus like where everything transpired. And so, I mean, that's just like things that are accessible that we should try to like, get our hands on, and just ask ourselves the questions like, what is the narrative and what is it trying to get us to think, and just question it a little bit. Anything that sounds super negative sometimes is just not like at all what is happening.
I think also, okay. I think also like we need to bring it home, right? Like weapons of mass destruction. And then, oops, sorry, the mass deception. Like historically, the media has been like the receptionist for the elite. Like these are the ones putting out whatever notes the elite wants them to put out. Like yesterday we were having a Gramsci class upstairs, and it was really like, we need to understand that every time there has been a war, the New York Times has been the one to release the first shit out. We gotta support it somehow. Like when we talk about the occupation of the mind as being, and this is why this is called the battle of ideas, because ultimately, like, there's an occupation of our brain where we engage with whatever media outlet there is, and there's a way of telling us that these are our enemies, and these are all the reasons why they are enemies. And then following that is the dehumanization of those enemies. Sounds like Mike Brown almost, right? But what did he do? Like he deserved to get shot if he did something, right? Like there's a justification for murdering a black young man because he was big and I got scared, right? So like there's a narrative that's created, there's a normalization of that, there's a criminalization of that, and then there's the actual imminent force that comes in. And it's a circle, and that's what the media does to us. Because again, at the end of the day, it's something that is owned and serves the elite class. And if we are unable to understand it that way, and the questions are, again, who owns it? And not only who owns it, but to what end? How does this benefit these folks? Like, my niece is 17, and for some reason, some odd reason, she was listening to Trump talk, and she goes, he said socialist. I don't like Trump, so socialism must be good. I'm like, you're on the right track. You are and she's 17, right? So she's starting to question a lot of the things and trying to gain what politics are. And I'm like, you know who your enemy is, and you know exactly that whatever your enemy is for, you're against. That's a good way of thinking about it. So we need to first also acknowledge ourselves as a class and understand that none of these mofos want anything with us. And whatever they do, they're going to do it against our class. And if we have that consciousness, then it's easier for us to question.
Well, I think our panelists channeled a little bit of Malcolm X, who used to say, you know, the press will have you hating your own oppressed brothers and sisters and loving the people who oppress them.
That's right.
But precisely because we are in a battle of ideas, and the fight actually takes place every day in our own communities, in our streets, in every space that we occupy, we leave this space with a commitment. Many of us are going to hop on a bus on March 16th, but many more of us are going to continue talking about Venezuela. Many of us, when we're confronted with the lies that are smeared against the people of Venezuela every day, we're going to raise our voices, no matter how uncomfortable it may be, because we're on the bus and we want to seem chill and not be the loud ones talking about poor people fighting back. But that's part of our responsibility every day. And inch by inch, piece by piece, we will begin to transform the narrative that has been constructed against the people of Venezuela. So thank you for joining us tonight. If you want to share this with your friends, just know that the link to this live stream and the recording will be available on YouTube. You can share with your friends and all those who didn't make it tonight. Thank you, and keep coming back to the People's Forum.